Now, it's no secret that Thor Love and Thunder has turned out to be a fucking disastrous addition to an already struggling Marvel Phase 4. A lazy, paint-by-numbers kind of movie that squanders its talented cast on a script that feels like it was written by a hyperactive 12-year-old, featuring pointless, ego-stroking roles for its director and his girlfriend, and some of the worst CGI this side of Joss Whedon's Justice League. But the more I think about this turd of a movie, the more I realise that it actually offers a pretty interesting opportunity to compare two scenes from the same director, which perfectly illustrate why one movie worked pretty well and the other failed miserably. And just to make sure that we're all on the same page, let's first consider what the fuck a scene actually is, how it's defined, and what purpose it serves. Well, at its most basic level, a scene is an event or interaction usually taking place within a constrained time period or physical location, and involving one or more characters saying or doing things. Scenes are the building blocks of your story, and in the case of good writing, they should build on each other to eventually develop a cohesive narrative. Scenes can be used for lots of different things, and there's no absolute rules on what can and can't be done, but generally speaking, they fall into three main categories. 1. Advancing the plot. This is the simplest and most obvious purpose for any scene. Basically, something happens which moves the story forward in some way. 2. Character development. The scene provides an insight into the personality, backstory, or perspective of one or more of its characters. 3. World building. The scene tells you a bit more about the world the characters are part of, its history, its rules, or the general state of affairs. At a bare minimum, a scene should accomplish at least one of these things to be considered a worthwhile addition to the story. If it manages to do two of them effectively, then I consider it a well-written scene that obviously had a bit of thought put into it. And if it manages to do all three without feeling forced or contrived, then that right there is the hallmark of some pretty talented writing. Anyway, keep this in mind as we begin our little analysis because it's going to be important. So first up, we're going to take a look at the theatre scene from Thor Ragnarok. Now, I've said before that I've got my issues with this movie, but one thing I'll give it credit for is the writing is a hell of a lot smarter than the sequel, and this scene is a great example of it. The scene begins with Thor returning to Asgard in the middle of a crisis to find what appears to be his father Odin relaxing with wine and snacks, watching a cheesy play about his two sons. Strange stuff indeed, and very out of character for a stern and committed man like Odin. On the face of it, this scene might just be another goofy comedy skit in a film that's practically bursting at the seams with them, but when you look a little closer, you begin to realise that it's actually a pretty smart piece of writing. This scene works for comedy value because it's funny to see relatively serious actors like Matt Damon and Luke Hemsworth tearing the arse out of their performances as comically bad theatre actors.
I'm sorry about that thing with the Tesseract. I just couldn't help myself. I know. I'm a trickster. Yes, so mischievous. Yeah.
I mean, it's not exactly gonna have you rolling in the aisles, but, you know, it's okay, I guess. They're recreating a scene that'll instantly be familiar to anyone who watched Thor 2, where Loki apparently sacrifices his life to save Thor. But the more the scene goes on, the more it becomes obvious that this is far from an accurate retelling of what actually happened. It's slanted in a specific direction, portraying Loki as the unsung, misunderstood hero, and Thor as the dumb, ungrateful brother who realises his mistakes too late. It's over the top, self-serving and melodramatic, so why exactly would Odin of all people be indulging in it?
Alright, I yield!
Suddenly it all makes sense, and it perfectly lines up with Loki's self-absorbed, narcissistic personality. Like any good narcissist, he sees himself as the flawless, tragically misunderstood hero of his own story, and naturally he wants everyone else to see him the same way. It tells us a great deal about Loki as a character, not just in how he sees himself, but also how he views previous events and the world around him. This also serves as setup for the eventual payoff at the end of the movie, when Loki chooses to set aside his own personal ambition to do the right thing and help his brother. And even better, when he gets unmasked for his true identity, it also serves to move the plot forward by ultimately reuniting both brothers with their father Odin, who's been abandoned on Earth. It accomplishes 4 different things all at the same time. 1. Advancing the plot to a major event that will set the rest of the story in motion. 2. Giving us an insight into at least one major character and setting up a character arc with a satisfying payoff at the end. 3. Building up the world by explaining the decline of Asgard as a major power under Loki's ineffective leadership. 4. Making the audience laugh by providing an entertaining scene. And what's impressive is that it manages to do all 4 of these things without ever feeling forced, contrived or clunky. Each component of the scene fits logically into the others, complementing rather than conflicting with them, so that most people aren't even aware of the pretty complex stuff going on in the background. That's pretty fucking impressive from a writing point of view, and it underscores how much creative thought and planning actually went into Thor Ragnarok. Almost like the writing team were actually good at their jobs. Now let's take a look at a very similar scene from Love and Thunder, which in this case was written mostly by Taika Waititi himself. I wonder how that'll compare. Again, it's a theatrical play being put on by the same characters, this time on Earth, playing mostly to an audience of human tourists. In this scene, it's covering one of the key moments in Ragnarok when Odin has one final conversation with his sons before peacefully passing on, and in return releasing Hela back into the real world. On the surface, it's the same hammy acting and cheesy improvised special effects, but the difference here is in what the scene actually accomplishes from a writing point of view. All that clever mechanical stuff that's supposed to be going on in the backgrounds. The previous play was a humorous insight into the mind and motivations of the man behind it, a stepping stone to major plot revelations, and a useful piece of world building. This time the play serves no purpose at all. It wasn't commissioned by anyone in particular, it's just the actors putting on a show for tourists, so it loses out on one major writing objective right off the bat. But what about the other 2 objectives? Well, it doesn't move the plot forward, that's for sure. There's no major events which are triggered by this scene or logically follow on from it. It's just a standalone thing which happens for a couple of minutes. You could easily delete it from the film and the rest of the story would carry on exactly as before. If I had to be super generous, I'd say that it at least tries to explain how Thor's hammer got broken in the previous movie, which kind of feeds into the next scene with Jane looking over the broken pieces as a museum exhibit. But again, it's just not necessary because a single line of dialogue from this tour guide would have been more than enough to do the same job. Or integrate it into the opening monologue from Korg, since Taika seems to love the sound of his own fucking voice so much. Also, you have to question how valuable a summary of past events is at this stage in the franchise. I mean, really, how many people do you think are watching Love and Thunder that haven't seen Ragnarok already? It definitely doesn't help with the world building either. The film's trying to show us that the once powerful, galaxy-spanning Asgardian empire has become a tacky tourist destination, selling a cheap, bastardized version of their cultural heritage for a few measly dollars. I mean, if you were a cynical man like me, you could probably draw some interesting comparisons with how Disney treats Norse mythology in the MCU, but I suspect that's a level of awareness that Taika doesn't possess. The problem is that the movie's already established this stuff perfectly well with a montage of other scenes right before it. It's already planted the seeds in the mind of the audience, so this scene is doing nothing but reiterating stuff that they already know. And it doesn't exactly do it quickly either. The scene goes on for almost 2 full minutes, and believe me, you feel every fucking second of it. Why? Because it's not funny. It's not a subtle retelling of previous events with an obvious agenda at work, it's just a copy-paste from the last film. After barely 30 seconds, I was totally bored and just wishing the scene would end so we could move on. And things didn't exactly improve when Melissa McCarthy showed up as Hela. Seriously, was this woman ever fucking funny at anything? Not only does the scene fail to give us any insight into any of the characters involved, set up any significant payoffs for later in the story, or move the plot forward in any way that couldn't be accomplished far more quickly and efficiently, but it even fails to make us laugh. It's an absolutely pointless scene that fails to satisfy any of the requirements for why it should even be part of the film, and I think it's a perfect example of a writer-director with a deeply flawed mindset about movie making. See, the success of Thor Ragnarok gave Taika Waititi a lot of creative freedom to make his next Thor movie, including the chance to write the script all by himself. And I think this is where Love and Thunder really went off the rails. See, Taika's clearly got a talent for comedy, and he's not exactly lacking in creativity and ideas, but the thing he does lack is focus and discipline. The behind the scenes footage make him look like a kid that's been turned loose in a candy store. He just wants to mess around, try out new ideas, experiment, have fun. He's not too worried about pesky little details like continuity, plot consistency, pacing, or maintaining an appropriate emotional tone. Now that's less of a problem when you're doing some little indie movie or a quirky low budget comedy show, but it's not so good when you're put in charge of a $200 million franchise film. His approach with Love and Thunder was to shoot basically any and every idea that popped into his head, no matter how good or bad, and then just see what he could hammer together in the editing bay. That's why the original cut was apparently 4 hours long, and even Chris Hemsworth described it as basically unwatchable, sacrificing plot, character, logic, and everything else for the sake of a few jokes. Now, I don't doubt that Taika Waititi is a creative guy, but he's definitely a director that needs oversight and level-headed people around to curb his wilder instincts, and that's the thing that was sorely lacking here. He wrote the theatre scene because it was a funny callback to a well-received scene from the last movie without really considering why it worked so well last time around. He wanted the payoff, the cheap and easy laughter, the quick dopamine hit, without doing any of the work needed to make it successful. It demonstrates only the most basic, surface-level understanding of what made the scene function, and really it's pretty emblematic of his entire approach to Love and Thunder. It was a low-effort, low-intelligence, undisciplined production put together by a man that had started to buy into his own hype, confident in his own abilities, and too complacent to push himself to do anything better. That's why he hasn't been asked back for Thor 5. And if nothing else, it should probably serve as a lesson to most aspiring filmmakers about how not to put a movie together. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Go away now.